A call to order today's Defence Committee evidence session on UK's contribution to European security. And I'm very delighted that we have with us our two panellists for our first panel, which will run for an hour before we begin our second panel with Professor Roberts. So first of all, a very, very warm welcome to Dr. Rowan Allport, the Deputy Director at the Human Security Centre, and also a very warm welcome to William Freer, who is a Research Fellow in National Security at the Council on Geostrategy. So without any further delay, I will ask my colleague Calvin Bailey to start off on the questions.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to you both for joining us here today. So the first part of the discussion, I think, is to try and understand or to be able to understand what our contribution would look like for NATO, but also I'm fairly keen to separate or understand the differences between a NATO contribution to NATO, but also NATO's part in European security. So NATO has a remit that is greater than Europe, and that we could see NATO particularly focused in the Indo-Pacific, because the edges of Canada and United States also focus over there. And should it be thus focused, there'll be an amount of resource and attention that will need to be left behind in Europe to ensure that European security remains paramount, even if NATO is focused elsewhere. So with that in mind, and I really enjoyed your piece in particular, Dr. Rowan, about the 1966, 67, 68 defence reviews and the change of our focus. But could you talk to us about what you think our contribution to NATO should look like, noting that at times NATO could leave Europe alone and leave a gap which we would perhaps have to fill?
Well, I think our contribution to NATO is sort of conventional, unconventional, not quite full spectrum. There are gaps that we can address if you wish, but so broad rundown, you've got the nuclear deterrent, of course, declared to the deterrence of NATO, chiefly a deterrent, chiefly a political component, really. Then you've got the special forces, conventional forces, cyber and what have you, intelligence gathering, diplomacy, and then you've got sort of the lesser known non-military components, sort of economic and industrial, and the geographical infrastructure. We're going to, I think, possibly be talking about the vulnerability of the UK to missile strikes and things like that. We are geographically blessed in that we are not close to potential launch points, at least in terms of land launch points. We do have some maritime vulnerability.
Across those capabilities,
yes.
How and where would you focus and increase, and why?
I would definitely focus and increase on the conventional element, chiefly because NATO is pivoting towards a strategy in terms of defence of Eastern Europe, strategy of denial. Previously, it was the model, although obviously not too much publicly discussed, the model was broadly a concept of a tripwire force, of which the British component in Estonia was a part of. The idea was that we would probably lose elements of Eastern Europe to European territory, and then we would sort of go back after a period and liberate them. The Kuwait model, for example, that happened during the Gulf War. Now it's more of a forward defence approach, so to avoid the losses. Obviously, we've seen what happens to territory in Ukraine that Russia takes over, just sort of complete devastation in various parts that were taken and then liberated by Ukrainian forces. So we're sort of very incentivised to avoid any initial losses. So I think that would be where I'd focus investment.
A conventional increase,
yes,
in European capability under the NATO vehicle, or under a European vehicle such as the JEF or other constructs?
Under a NATO vehicle chiefly. I think it's important to understand, if we're sort of going to go back to sort of what the US has been saying in the last couple of months, it's important to understand that a lot of what they're saying, although it has been not presented particularly pleasantly or smoothly, there is a great deal of logical thought. The US is desperately trying to sort of convince us, to sort of persuade us that they cannot ride to the rescue because they have they have the issue of China to deal with, and they cannot. The worst plausible case scenario for NATO right now is the potential for a war on. It's potential for the US to be at war with China, or at least heavily engaged in a crisis with China, and Russia sort of comes in and tries to take advantage of that situation. Go on.
So with that being the case, and was the position that I was trying to set out, that NATO ultimately could have its attention faced elsewhere, and therefore would need to make sure the sanctity of its responses, that you may need to deliver tactical actions somewhere else, mainly in Europe. And you think that's something that NATO could do concurrently whilst occupied in the East, or is that not the place that the GEF and the like should step in?
Well, I think even in the event of two simultaneous crises, it would be the US and it would be overwhelmingly in lead in terms of sort of continental defence. NATO would provide potential some sort of supporting role, but it would be very much sort of a backseat in terms of providing defensive capabilities to the continental United States and Canada. So I think that in the event of a crisis, it would be Europe would be NATO's absolute priority, and the US would sort of take the lead as a national tasking in the Pacific.
William, is that something, a view that you would hold, or that a crisis in Indo-PACOM that fixes certain parts of, or draws away certain parts of US capability could be dealt with tactically by NATO?
I think that NATO in the last sort of 20 years has had a track record of looking in its sort of more general 360-degree view, and especially focusing on out-of-area operations, but that they have very much been refocusing on the deterrence and defence aspect of their job in Europe in recent times. And that's not to say that European security does not stop at the European borders. It has security interests that extend beyond that. But I think that any operation in the Indo-Pacific, given NATO's laser focus on the Russia threat, would be unlikely to be NATO-led like previous out-of-area operations have been.
No, but NATO is inseparable from its membership, and the Americans and Canadians are members of NATO, and if fixed in Indo-PACOM, they would want to maintain the integrity of a collective response, and therefore something below collective response would be something that another organisation maybe would have to look at. That's kind of the question where I'm trying to... Does NATO have the capacity? If so, or if not, how would we backfill that capacity, and in which areas? Dr. Allport pointed to conventional forces. I'm wondering if there's any other views.
Yes, I think on the question is essentially sort of where are there gaps if the US were to withdraw assets from the NATO area of operations, and I think the answer is highly dependent on what kind of withdrawal would happen and what that looks like. And the main question for European powers is which assets are most likely to be withdrawn, and which of those capability gaps are the most important to fill. And I think that there are a broad range of capabilities that the US has present in Europe at the moment. On paper, it doesn't look like a massive amount of Europe's forces. It's something like 5 of 140 combat brigades are American, and about 10% of the combat air forces in Europe are American. But the general contribution is a lot bigger than that. Some of that is things that can't be moved in the event of a crisis in the Indo-Pacific, so things like the leadership positions that the US has, SACEUR, the C2 that they can provide, but a lot of the assets that are most useful to Europe, things like American air and naval power, would be the assets most likely to be withdrawn towards the Indo-Pacific in the event of a crisis. And I think one thing that we really need to bear in mind is that the Americans have long said that they want to refocus towards the Indo-Pacific. And even though there hasn't been much movement in that direction, that's no reason to think that they won't enact it. And I think the most dangerous point that could happen is European countries go, well, the Americans have been saying this, and yet their presence in Europe has actually grown. In 2013 was the sort of low point of US personnel in Europe, and it's since gone up because of the events in Ukraine. But that overnight, if a crisis occurs, America might suddenly withdraw a lot of conventional forces from the European area, at which point the Russians might seek to take the most of that opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let me bring in Lincoln Joppe.
So the areas that you've highlighted as being where Europe is most reliant on the US, you've said they are air and maritime. Can we look at the less obvious and potentially less sexy end of the sort of equation and look at sustainability, ammunition, satellites. To what extent is Europe sort of totally reliant on the US in those areas, and do they fall under, well, they can't be moved, because they sound to me like they can be moved very quickly?
I think, do you want me to...
I'll just say, there are some capabilities that we have marginal abilities, some completely lacking, sort of satellites that can detect the launch plumes from missiles we don't have. They cannot be moved, though. The US has sort of a global capability of that. There would be no benefit in sort of removing that capability from Europe. A big issue that doesn't get enough discussion is our reliance on the US as a sort of storage bin for munitions. Whenever we need them during the Falklands, we request things like latest model Sidewinder missiles and Stinger missiles, and they were delivered quickly because we didn't have them in sufficient quantity immediately to hand. And I suspect that's similar. So, for example, the British Army is currently building up its MLRS force. There are a lot of launches. I forget the exact number. I think the plan is eventually for 72 or something like that. But they consume ammunition at a fast rate, and I severely doubt that plans are in place to stop, even with the plans to expand munition stockpiles. I seriously doubt the UK has plans in place to have enough ammunition on hand for a particularly prolonged period of time of intense usage.
Yeah, the US enablers are absolutely vital. NATO's essentially built on the bedrock of fighting the American way of fighting. And a lot of the sort of enablers include things like intelligence collection. Some of that is space-based, so as has been pointed out, not necessarily any reason why that can't still be delivered, although at the end of the day, it's a political choice, as we've seen in Ukraine. And things like logistics, airlift, sea lift, huge contribution by the Americans. And it's a gap that they have got to fill in the Indo-Pacific as well. So to the extent that that could see a reduction is also something to bear in mind. And one of the key areas in the air is airborne tankers. About 20% of the airborne tankers in Europe at the moment are American. And the other aspect to potentially consider is that NATO's often worked on the assumption that if some kind of a conflict were to kick off in Europe, that American reinforcements would come across the Atlantic. And although I think in the air and naval space, again, that's less likely to happen because of how much those assets are going to be needed in any contingency involving the Chinese. I think the US Army is a lot less needed in the Indo-Pacific, and so we might still see those reinforcements coming across. They still have, I think, 2 divisions worth of stockpiles waiting in Europe for personnel to come across to pick up if needed.
And so, if those are the pinch points, and let's say this isn't the day of the races, this is now Europe growing its capability over a longer period in order to fulfill that potential gap, or those potential gaps. Where would you think that Britain should be looking to European allies and partners to be playing their part in growing into that space? And I guess the sort of corollary of that is, where would we seek to leverage our natural advantage, experience, or specialisation into us providing that capability in the absence of an American support?
I think that it's definitely something that we should be looking at, is to not duplicate what allies are doing and to try and design our forces in a complementary manner. A lot of our allies are not well placed to replace those US assets. The European defence sector is quite fragmented, although this is a problem that they're aware of and are working to fix. But we've essentially got a lot of small-ish and medium-sized European powers that have got sort of miniature pocket armies that are very similar, but lack the sort of high-level enablers, and which are totally reliant on sort of UK-US maritime power to cover the flanks and the reinforcements, and in particular suppression of enemy air defences and destruction of enemy air defences. Although some European countries have those capabilities to an extent, which is a combination of the munitions you need, the training that you go through, and the command and control in the air that's needed to direct those operations, without the Americans providing the bulk of the SEAD and DIAD capabilities, European countries currently would be in a poor position to enact that kind of a campaign, which is vital to achieving air superiority, which NATO land forces work on the assumption will achieve. So I think there's definitely conversations that need to be had around further specialization. Understandably, you can only go so far. I think in a utopian world, you might completely silo countries and say, you just focus on intelligence aircraft, you just focus on armored divisions. But even if we move in that direction, we'll never go the full way. So it's about finding the right balance.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And so there is already some degree of specialisation. Estonia is particularly strong in cyber, for example. The UK, in terms of generalisations, I think we need sort of countries like Poland and Finland to provide sort of land force mass. There is no point in us trying to recreate the British Army of the Rhine. I think the sort of the concept that Britain and France each provide one of the strategic reserve corps for NATO. I think the UK is probably looking at trying to put together 2 divisions in some form. It's probably the right balance between sort of the complete abdication of not doing land forces and making a substantial contribution. Beyond that, though, I think that it's important that it's understood that all of this is reasonable when you consider everything the Ukrainians have accomplished without a lot of the technology and the enablers that we're talking about today. So it's not sort of a council of despair. There is a sort of a way to meet these demands without necessarily reaching US levels of capability, but still coming up with what is adequate to what is adequate to what is needed.
Would it be fair to say that we should be looking at what we contribute the second most after America to sort of whether that's SEAD or whatever, and pushing hard on those things in order to be able to form the basis of a credible Europe-only capability?
I think the UK in particular is very well placed to fill any potential US capability gaps, given one, our sort of very close working relationship with the Americans, and particularly one of the big gaps, intelligence collection as a member of Five Eyes, and holding assets like the Rivet Joint. We're already in an okay position to replace some of those capabilities. It's just about building them out, depending on to what extent American assets might be withdrawn. And the fact that we have got a strong sort of history of conducting operations at scale compared to any other European country. That's one of our sort of unique selling points that we can provide to European countries, although you still have to have a decent measure of conventional mass behind it to make the claim that you've got a right to a leadership position within certain formations.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I want to bring back Calvin Bailey, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to pull on a thread that you exposed there, William. You talked about some of the conventional deficiencies that we had, most notably strategic airlift, but most important, probably most critically, AAR. So AAR is a deficiency for within NATO and the US. And it's something that is easily moved from one theatre to another. So noting that NATO has a shortage of AAR, is this something that you would expect to see us address within the Strategic Defence Review?
Yeah, you'd certainly expect it to be addressed. We've got a decent air-to-air refuelling fleet already, although it is a lot smaller than it used to be. We used to have 16 VC-10s and 9 TriStar tankers back in the late 2000s, and we're now down to just 9 A330 tankers. But one of the problems that our current tanker fleet has is that they're not equipped with boom refueling, which is crucial to refueling a sort of large number of the variants of aircraft used in NATO, including some of the larger ones, but also the F-35A, which, although we do not have, a lot of our allies who we will be supporting have acquired. We've currently only got the probe and drogue air-to-air refueling capability on the A330s, and hopefully adding in the boom capability is something that's being looked at.
Okay, just point of clarity, it's 9 plus 4, because there's also the 4 aeroplanes that we lease out, and there's also potentially 22 A400s that could also do probe and drogue. Sorry, Doctor.
I would just point out that we're sort of with the Americanization, well, there's always been a heavy American component, but the Americanization of the fleet, we've got aircraft, an ever-increasing number of aircraft that we cannot refuel in flight. We cannot refuel C-17s, we cannot refuel P-8s, and we will not be able to refuel the wedge-tail aircraft when they come into service at the moment. We would be dependent on Allied capability for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Derek Quick, please.
If we don't indulge, Joe, to just pick up something, Dr. Rowan, you had a conversation earlier with Calvin Bailey. a lot of focus at the moment in terms of why Europe needs to step up and we need to step up is because of the President's, in terms of actions and what he said and done and administration. But the bit you were discussing, I don't think has been highlighted enough in terms of this debate. It's actually more than that, isn't it? Because we just said if there was a conflict blew up between China and the US or on the North-South Korean border, that could have major implications for the ability, not just in terms of the United States keeping their assets and people here, but actually being able to draw in other people in times of a crisis, and whether Russia would take advantage of that situation, peace deal or no peace deal. Do you think enough serious thinking is being given to that?
In the UK?
Yeah.
In the UK, it's difficult to tell.
That maybe answers the question.
Well, yeah, it's a bit difficult to tell. I mean, I've been looking at sort of the US angle for this for the last couple of years now. It's been a sort of growing realization in the US for going on for 30 years now. Since the 90s, they've steadily had this realization of the Pacific issue. They believe China would potentially be the issue. Then it sort of developed further from there. What I think the one core takeaway that needs to be emphasized that I don't think is understood is that China represents a far greater challenge to the US than Nazi Germany, than Imperial Japan or the Soviet Union. They are a true peer. The US is not saying that Europe needs to step up to be difficult or because of MAGA or anything like that. It is doing it because it could not do a war on two fronts. This is not 1941. It could not repeat that kind of performance that it did back then.
Yeah, okay, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Just following from Lincoln Jock's questions, in terms of the capability gaps if the US basically pulled out or reduced its commitments here. And you touched on this, and we've talked about refueling aircraft, we've talked about logistics and intelligence. I mean, there's already in NATO a major logistics shortfall anyway, and as there is a capability shortfall in NATO, so it's not just ourselves and the US who've got their own capability shortfalls. I think, William, you sort of hinted that the UK could step up. Well, given we're losing 300 people a month from our armed forces, the Army needs 100% recapitalisation. We've already talked about the capability gaps. How is it going to do that? How are we going to do that? And given that most serious commentators say that 2.5% of GDP is actually nowhere near enough, so I just wondered, are we talking theory here, or are we talking actually what could practically be done in a say, over, for instance, 6 months, a year, 2 years?
Well, I think I'll start with the end bit first. I think the time frame is important to identify in terms of how long it would take Russia to reconstitute from the current conflict. I think probably the most pessimistic I've seen is 2 years. Right. And I think the UK's assessment is 5 years to get back to where they were in February 2022 and 10 years to do what they want to do in terms of force expansion. So there is a fair... I don't want to sound complacent, but it's not sort of they will not immediately pivot to a conflict with NATO as and when Ukraine finishes. So, for example, I don't think there's a particular problem with the HIMARS deployment going on right now. So to get to your main point, I think there are issues like sort of recruitment problems that have been going on for a decade plus. I remember I was in a session not unlike this one over, I think in 2013, when there were people who were trying to apply to the armed forces standing up in the audience and saying my application has been delayed or rejected for some incredibly trivial reason. Beyond that, it's money, it's terms and conditions of service and all sorts of things like that. I would probably prioritise looking after things like the Royal Fleet Auxiliary first. That's a small force, but it's just completely hemorrhaging human resources at the moment. Desperately needs resourcing and upgrading in terms of the terms and conditions. So it would be on sort of the narrow specialisms that I would start and then move out from there.
Well, based on where we are today, we would have struggled to replace those capabilities, the US.
Yes, where we are today, it would be very, very difficult, and I think it's important that we have a conversation with the US about sort of a steady transfer of responsibility. It needs to be controlled. So, for example, I think one thing the US may do in the next couple of years is potentially stop rotating sort of largely sort of army units that they've been rotating through Europe since 2014, and they stepped it up again in 2022. So we probably need to sort of arrange a handoff for that and who takes over responsibility for those units in terms of training and in terms of sort of their availability for defending Europe.
And do you think it's, sorry before I come to William, but is it in terms of, because we've touched on this, in terms of intelligence, and obviously we're pretty preeminent in terms of Europe, but it's a reliance on Starlink and American systems and so on. Are we anywhere near being able to stand on our own in Europe on that? I think I know the answer, but I'd be interested to know your...
It's not. The alternatives are not as dynamic and as flexible and as high bandwidth as Starlink. They do exist, but they all come with their own constraints.
Yeah, so we'd struggle.
We would struggle. Starlink is one of those. Sometimes technology comes along at the exact right moment, and that's what happened in Ukraine with Starlink. And I don't think that they've actually just started. Amazon has just started launching its equivalent. I think they went up. The first major batch went up a few hours ago, actually, and that will probably provide a degree of redundancy in a couple of years from now. But for the moment, you have got capabilities which we owned for a period. I forget, was it OneWeb, and that was sold on, but they are more limited than Starlink.
Okay. William, do you want to add anything?
I think the ultimate question is again that point of would a US withdrawal be a sort of walk away from NATO or just redeploying assets to where they think they need them the most? If it is a complete walkaway, which I think is incredibly unlikely, but not something you could ever completely rule out, then you're talking much, much greater increases in defence spending to replace some of those capabilities that the US would be willing to support NATO with, but that might not necessarily be removed if they are repositioning certain forces to the Indo-Pacific. I think this is something that NATO's always had to think about. I mean, you could go back to Eisenhower, who said in the 1950s, if in 10 years' time there's still US troops in Europe, then NATO's failed, and yet there are still US troops present. The big change was in sort of 2010 and 11 when, under the Obama administration, the Americans talked about their pivot to Asia, and European countries, ourselves included, were quite slow to react to that and spent sort of 10 years not really acting on those things that the Americans had said. I think now that the process is accelerating, there has been a lot of positive steps already taken. In NATO's defence planning process, they've already said that by the end of the decade, they will have significantly reduced the overall share of targets borne by the US. So clearly there's already some conversations going on around, well, what is the balance of, if the US is going to draw down, do we have a timetable that we can work to, and how does that impact what we need to invest in and what time frame we're working to? I think on some of the other points that you've made, people and munitions, especially in the short term, absolutely vital to get a hold of those problems. There's no point in investing in fancy new platforms if you've not got people to use them and weapons to fire. And I think that's something that has very much been at the forefront of support for Ukraine, and those lessons have really hit home, and that conflict might not necessarily be a short, sharp affair. We've got to be able to sustain the fight. On the people front, it's true that the armed forces have really struggled, but recently there's been some positive changes. Radican pointed out that in the next couple of years, they expect the numbers to start going up. The Navy, which has long struggled with recruitment and retention, is already starting to see an increase, which is really positive to see on the things like the medical requirements and waiting times. Those are known problems that have been acted on. And another thing that I'd like to throw out there, that it comes up anecdotally, so I can't provide any numbers or any solutions, but anecdotally speaking with junior officers thinking of the retention side of things, career management is often cited by those thinking of leaving.
Thank you, Raj. If I can bring in Lincoln Job again, please.
Yeah, Dr. Allport, you said we're not in a sort of Second World War situation, but one parallel does strike me that I seem to remember from my reading of the Allenbrook diaries that much of his challenge as the then CDS effectively was to convince our American allies that a Europe first strategy was essential. Do you think that the revelation that 155 members of the Chinese People's Liberation Army have been found fighting on the Russian side in Ukraine in any way changes the American calculus?
I don't think so. We would need to look into what the circumstances behind those people joining the Russian forces were. I mean, they could be intelligence operatives, they could be sort of mercenaries or anything like that. So we would need that kind of information. I don't think it would fundamentally change the balance, because the US knows that China has a sort of a narrow path to walk in terms of its support for Russia in the conflict, which I think, well, basically China is not keen to overly antagonize Europe, because in the event of conflict they would not want Europe to go in wholesale with the US. So I think they have an incentive to not directly support Russia in this context, but it largely depends on what those people were doing there.
Have you got a view?
Yes, so I think that there's definitely very close links between the security in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, and this is something that a lot of countries have been keen to stress. The Japanese are very keen to have stronger ties with NATO. The Australians have been providing impressive levels of support for Ukraine. South Korea provided a lot of ammunition in lieu by giving it to the Americans to free up ammunition to go to Ukraine. So it's definitely something that weighs on their minds, and General Saka was in front of the Senate a couple of weeks ago talking about the potential for multi-theatre crises happening at the same time. So it's clearly something that the US military is planning on. I just think that the balance of military power in the Western Pacific has gotten to such a point that the US is incredibly nervous about what the result of a potential conflict in the region might be, and that they very much want to focus on that theatre first. And this was also a tension in the Second World War, and I don't know if you know much about Admiral King, the American head of the Navy, but he was very opposed to the Europe first. So this is a tension that we've long had to manage, and in fact in the Cold War, during the Vietnam War, there was a lot of concern in Europe that America was being drawn into the Asia Pacific, and that's one of the reasons why they started the Reforger Return of Forces to Germany exercises, which happened every year. So there are definitely links between the two, and the Americans are keen to try and do what they can in both. It's just that the Western Pacific is the absolute priority for them.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You may be aware that our committee has launched this month an inquiry into AUKUS, and we have made a public call for evidence. But I want to go on to what the Defence and Foreign Secretaries stated. As soon as they took office, they jointly wrote an article saying that it should be a NATO-first approach, and I quote, that European security will be our foreign and defence priority. But within the same article, they also noted that they are fully committed to AUKUS. So in your opinion, Dr. Allport, can both be achieved?
I think they can. I think a lot of the NATO first stuff is sort of rhetorical to separate them from the previous government. One area that does potentially raise issues is sort of the commitment to forward station an astute from Australia as soon as, I think was the language used, 2027. There are supposed to be 7 delivered ultimately. So 1 out of 7 doesn't sound much, but when you account for those that are in refit, in maintenance, it suddenly becomes a significant part of the fleet. And that's doubly so because one current major advantage that the US has over China that they will maintain for a few years yet is in sort of nuclear-powered attack submarines, and they will be keen to reallocate as many of those from the Atlantic to the Pacific as they can, probably certainly in peacetime and absolutely in time of conflict. And it also, sort of to pull that thread a bit further, it raises the question of how distant could we remain from a conflict in the Western Pacific if one emerged. Australia would be a major sort of operating base for the US, and if we have probably one of our single most capable conventional assets based there, would that pressure us to get involved? Would we leave? Would that be to come back to Europe? Would that be politically possible? Would we send reinforcements? So it sort of gives us a degree of commitment to the Pacific that wasn't previously there, particularly given our sort of political and cultural relationship with Australia that already exists.
Yeah, okay. And Mr. Freer, do you think that we can achieve both AUKUS as well as the focus of the priority of European security?
Yeah, I think they absolutely have to coexist, and it's not necessarily a question of either or. It's about the balance between resources in the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. And specifically on AUKUS, I think one of the most overlooked aspects of the agreement is the benefits to security in the Euro-Atlantic that the arrangement will have. The plan is in the long term for the Australians to acquire a number of the SSN AUKUS submarines, which is the British design, and I think the plan is for potentially up to 5 of those, which will significantly drive down unit costs for nuclear-powered attack submarines for the British, which means in theory we should be able to acquire more, given that they're such an important asset, which will boost numbers in the Euro-Atlantic, Pillar 2 as well, on the sharing sort of technology capability and working together with the Americans and the Australians will have great benefits for Euro-Atlantic security. The US has already worked to remove ITAR barriers for British firms working to and from America. And I think Dr. Rowan Allport's correct to identify the astute rotation as the greatest risk. The astute availability has been something of a concern in recent years, but the reasons for that were a couple of blockages in the infrastructure, slight delays in improving and upgrading infrastructure to transition from the Trafalgar class to the Astute class, and some problems in fast lane, which meant that Vanguard class submarines, which were given priority as the nuclear deterrent for maintenance, which caused a backlog. Some of those problems have been overcome, and there's a seventh Astute still to enter the water. So by 2027, the situation will have been much improved. It's just a question of how quickly that sort of backlog of maintenance delays is cleared.
Okay, but what implications do you think that the current conflict in Ukraine and what's going on with a reduced American presence, what impact will that have on AUKUS in particular?
I think the situation in Ukraine will have minimal impact on AUKUS. I think the Americans have their own debate on AUKUS, so they're divided, much as in Australia there's quite a powerful debate at the minute as to whether or not they should continue with it. The main sticking point for the Americans, similar to our Astute rotational deployment, would be the transfer of Virginia-class submarines in the 2030. But Admiral Paparo was in front of the Senate recently, and he said that he's very keen on AUKUS, and it will confer generational advantage, I think was the term he used, to the members of the agreement. So it's one of those things that can be, it fits perfectly with a NATO first policy.
Dr. Allport, in your opinion, what impact do you think what's going on in Ukraine at the moment and the reduced American presence, what impact would that have on AUKUS?
I would just repeat what my colleague said. Minimal impact. There is a sort of weak link in terms of how long the conflict goes on, how long it will take Russia to reconstitute its forces in order to become a threat to NATO again, and how long that we would have to potentially deploy a force in Europe. How long it would be before we would potentially have to deploy a force in Europe, potentially in combat to deal with that. But again, I don't think it makes a fundamental difference. I think the net gains are far greater than potential risks. Okay,
good. All right, to carry on the AUKUS theme, Michelle Scroggin, please.
Thank you, Chair. You've mentioned the rotation of AUKUS out to Australia as early as 2027, I believe. What do you feel are the implications for UK's maritime presence in the Euro-Atlantic on the back of that?
A lot depends on sort of force availability that we don't have, as William said. The infrastructural problems are being worked through, so while the availability of the Astutes have recently been quite dire, they should be somewhat improved. But as the dry docks and potentially, I think, floating dry docks that they're looking at come online, it will potentially have a significant effect in terms of the small force we have. 7 is not that many, as I said, when you have to account for maintenance and refits. There are ways to compensate for that, though. You could for example, buy more P8s. That would provide you with an alternative avenue for maritime situational awareness. And we're also looking at sort of underwater sensors and uncrewed maritime systems, uncrewed underwater vessels that can also provide you with sort of sensor platforms that can, to some extent, compensate for the reduced presence of nuclear attack submarines.
And William, your evidence. And I quote, the nuclear deterrent is by far the most significant contribution that the UK makes to NATO. Given uncertainty over American strategic priorities, ensuring unbroken CASD patrols, providing adequate protection for CASD patrols, and accelerating the construction of the Dreadnought class should be absolute priorities of UK defence policy. How do you see that actually happening when you're talking about the issues that we have actually bringing them into service? How do you see that coming forward quicker?
One of the main roles of the astutes is to provide protection for the ballistic missile submarines as they go out on patrol to make sure that the Russians aren't following them. But it's not just the nuclear-powered attack submarines that are involved in that. You know, you've got towed array patrol frigates, you've got maritime patrol aircraft. The Navy's working on its sort of Bastion Atlantic concept, which involves a lot of autonomous sensors patrolling the waters between Greenland, Iceland and Scotland, which will give us a lot more situational awareness to protect the ballistic missile submarines. And I think the main thing with the rotational deployment to Australia is if the situation does get worse, then the submarine can always be brought home if absolutely needed. But there are other means by which we can conduct maritime operations in the North Atlantic. But one of those astute submarines is absolutely vital to providing protection. There was a point, I think about 2 years ago, when the sort of open source intelligence knew where most of the submarines were, and we saw one of the ballistic missile submarines go out on patrol, quickly followed by an American nuclear-powered attack submarine. So it's useful to be able to lean on allies when you've got problems, but at the end of the day, if you can provide that protection yourself, it's even better.
And Dr. Allport, how would you see that developing if we could increase the speed at which we could deliver those? Where would you see that?
I'm not a defence industrial specialist, but I think it would be difficult to speed up my understanding of the situation is it would be difficult to speed up the delivery. There's sort of a sequence in terms of astutes, dreadnoughts, then the new generation of SSNs. I'm not sure how you could speed that up in terms of workforce recruitment and overall capacity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My colleague Michelle Scroggum has highlighted the implications on the UK. Now, let's try to get into the Russian psyche. If there are AUKUS submarines operating in the Indo-Pacific, in your opinion, Dr. Allport, would Russia see that as a threat to Russia's Far East? And then do you think that can have an implication on which way Russia faces, as in, given that it will perceive a threat to its Far East, that it may well then deploy more resources in that direction rather than towards Ukraine and the rest of Europe? Do you think that is the case?
Well, this is interesting. This was actually an argument by the US Pacific during the Cold War. This was an argument from the US Pacific Command for not deploying their assets to the Atlantic in wartime, because they could sort of distract the Russians by pinning them down in the east. But I don't think it's going to make a huge practical difference. The Russians know that sort of the AUKUS submarines will be primarily directed at sort of deterring China. Obviously, they consider the Pacific a very important sort of venue, a very important area of operations, but they are aware of sort of the wider situation and that they are not sort of chiefly the target.
Okay. Mr. Freer, in your opinion, do you think that this strategic ambiguity, will that actually help our European security as Russia concentrates more on its perceived threat to Russia's Far East, or do you think that won't be the case?
I think given that the AUKUS submarines will be based in West Australia, primarily patrolling sort of the Indian Ocean, potentially with a view to the South China Sea, that their ability to keep Russian assets, which they do have some significant naval assets deployed in the Far East, and it often gets overlooked, I think it would have a limited impact on keeping the Russians in that region. They're much more focused on Alaska and the US forces deployed up there. I think where it could make a significant impact is pinning the Chinese Navy in position in the Indo-Pacific, with the Chinese Navy's expansion both in size and in capability, including auxiliaries that can keep ships at sea. There's reason to expect that we'll see far more Chinese naval presence outside of the Indo-Pacific in the future, and especially with climate change opening up the northern sea routes, I don't think we should be surprised in the long term if we see Chinese naval forces cooperating with the Russians in the Arctic, and that AUKUS would be a very effective way of keeping the Chinese focused on the balance of military power in their home region.
Right, thank you very much. So let's move on now to nuclear deterrence with my colleague Ian Rue.
Good Chair. We've heard about the worrying comments from the US about withdrawing its nuclear umbrella to NATO. And what do you think? Do you think this is likely? And if so, what role could the UK play?
Well, I think the US Defence Secretary, when he was doing his speech, I think it was in February, said that he emphasised that it was Europe needs to take the lead in the conventional defence of Europe. So I don't think there's I wouldn't be too particularly alarmed about the withdrawal of the nuclear umbrella. Even if the US were less minded to sort of in private to use nuclear weapons or threaten the use of nuclear weapons in the event of that being required in Europe, it would not be in their interest to sort of vocalise it. It would just be a sort of thing lingering in the background. And to be honest, there's always been doubt about sort of the extended deterrence commitments of the US. It's a major thing to say we will use nuclear weapons on behalf of someone else, regardless of not of whether you're in alliance.
I would agree. It's in theory possible. It can't be ruled out, and it never could be. Hence why we were so keen to acquire our own nuclear weapons. If you read any of the books about Bevin, the main reason he wanted it was not necessarily to deter the Russians. It was to put a Union Jack on the top of it. So I think that it's definitely something to be mindful of, but I think it's extremely unlikely for the Americans to do that. I suppose what's more important is whether the Russians believe the umbrella is there. And the problem with extended deterrence is that ultimately, despite what statements and participation in nuclear sharing arrangements and the US Nuclear Posture Review, which is published every few years, is always pretty similar. They say the same things about their extended deterrence, but until it's tested, you'll never know if it's actually there.
Dr. Rowan, Allport, your evidence to the Human Security Council concluded that the US lack of airborne component to its nuclear force meant that it was not able to provide sub-strategic nuclear options. And I wanted to ask you, if the UK was looking in developing and investing in that area, where would you consider the best investment?
Well, I think I said that we do have a theoretical sub-strategic capability through Trident with a reduced yield warhead. Sources differ on whether that's still a going concern. I've heard different credible people say different things. In terms of acquiring a dedicated sub-strategic force, I am very sceptical unless there was a huge increase in resource allocation. There is just a massive list of things, conventional forces, shortfalls that need to be invested in before you get to the point where you can add on something like a sub-strategic deterrent. And you also have to consider, obviously there are issues like the deterrent ladder, and we went through debates like this in the 80s with do we want to replace the Falcon bombers that provided the sort of intermediate range, theatre long range, whatever you want to call it, nuclear force until they were retired. Do we want to replace them? I think the answer is, do we really think that our possession of a dedicated sub-strategic deterrent rather than a sort of ad hoc one in the form of Trident would alter Russian calculations meaningfully in terms of their actions? I think that would be a tough case to make.
Yes, I think the sort of sub-strategic or tactical nuclear weapon question is a huge one which we're very quickly having to grapple with. It's a massive grey area, and there's a lot of theoretical views on these systems, with some making the case that there's not really such a thing, and any use of a nuclear weapon is strategic. So I think in theory a sub-strategic weapon conveys demonstration of resolve or a warning, whereas a tactical nuclear weapon is about battlefield effect. So there's a lot of crossover between those two below a sort of strategic exchange. Russia is clearly not afraid of using nuclear threats to pursue its goals, and if it believed that there were doubts about the US, which provides the only tactical or sub-strategic nuclear weapons for the NATO sharing arrangements. The French have their own tactical nuclear weapons, but they're not a part of the nuclear sharing arrangements. So it's definitely something we have to factor in, is the fact that Russians have these systems. Some people will suggest that there are other means of deterring Russia from using tactical nuclear weapons, and the most common thing that is pointed to is the sort of devastation that a large-scale conventional precision strike salvo of missiles could achieve. But I think one of the problems with that is we've just identified suppression of enemy air defences as one of the major gaps in the event of a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, which would draw those US assets away. And I don't think we should underestimate the psychological impact of the use or threat of nuclear weapons as well, and what that would factor in on Russian calculations. So we do have the capacity to use Trident as a sub-strategic nuclear weapon, and in fact, previously we've explicitly stated that we intend to use it in that way. The 1998 Strategic Defence Review was explicit in that. There are a number of problems with using Trident as your sub-strategic option. The first one of those is that by using it, you would reveal the location of your ballistic missile submarine, which there may not be a Russian asset close enough that could get to it, but the Russians put a lot of energy into trying to find these submarines, as we've seen in recent reports of all the sort of monitoring systems that are washing up on beaches. So I don't think we should be trying to make their life any easier for them. The other problem is that there are a limited number of tubes to carry Trident missiles on the submarines. Vanguard currently has 16, and if you had one or two of those dedicated to sub-strategic use, that would probably mean only having one warhead on those, which limits the size of your strategic salvo, and the dreadnoughts will have 12 tubes, so even less. And most importantly, I think the greatest risk is the potential for miscalculation. If the Russians detected a Trident missile going up into space, they might not wait around to see if it was a sub-strategic one or a strategic one, because one would assume that if we've gotten to this point, the tensions are already running incredibly high, and Russia may have moved to a sort of launch on response or launch on detection posture. So there are a number of reasons why that's not necessarily workable. Critics will also say that the use of a sub-strategic weapon makes a strategic exchange more likely. It would very quickly escalate, but in a way that's the point. If the adversary believes that if they use theirs and you use yours and it quickly escalates, then they're less likely to want to use theirs, whereas if they have an asymmetry of advantage, they might seek to exploit it. And I think most interestingly of all, to bring it back to Admiral Paparo, the US Navy in the Indo-Pacific is going through this debate at the minute. They're looking to reacquire nuclear-tipped cruise missiles for their submarines as a tactical or sub-strategic option. And he put it very bluntly and said that the choice is either suicide or surrender when we have to default straight to strategic weapons. So I think there's definitely a case to be made for Britain reacquiring, because we used to have them, tactical or sub-strategic nuclear weapons. Again, there's a slight difference between the two. The huge problem which has been identified is opportunity cost. Every pound invested in this system would be less for conventional forces. There are ways of mitigating this. You could explore a British-led nuclear sharing program, and interestingly, a few years ago, the Bundestag Scientific Service in Germany concluded that legally Germany would be able to part fund allied nuclear weapons programs. So there's definitely areas to explore in mitigating the costs. But I think it's something we should absolutely be looking into, given Russia's known record of nuclear saber-rattling and doctrine on tactical nuclear weapons, on top of the fact that there are questions about the US commitment to NATO security.
Just talking on the French aspect from France and the nuclear component there, obviously it's not committed to NATO as the US and the UK are. Under what circumstances, given the situation at present, would it take for France to bring its nuclear deterrent within NATO?
I don't think they would. It's such a big thing for the French historically. Macron recently came out and made some statements saying that they were considering ways to extend their deterrence to allied countries. They have a very clear, sort of strictly limited to extreme circumstances of self-defense, which during the Cold War, given how close they were to the front line, the assumption was that that meant they would likely be used if the Soviets started rolling into West Germany. And in theory, although the French do make a big thing about it not being an extended deterrence, because of Article 42.7 of the Treaty of the EU, which is worded actually far more strongly than Article 5 in NATO as a security guarantee, it says that countries must use all means in their power to help someone else in the treaty who's under attack. So in theory, that extends the French deterrence, but they're so clear that it doesn't, that lots of other European countries don't have faith in the French extended deterrence. I mean, Sweden and Finland, while they were waiting to join NATO, although technically covered by Article 42.7, were very keen to get security guarantees from us to cover them in the interim because they didn't believe in the French deterrence covering them. They're considering changing it. but I think because it's such a big thing, it's unlikely to happen. There has been one noticeable deployment recently. The French Air Force recently did an exercise called Pegasus 25, and at least one of the Rafale fighters that was involved was from the air wing dedicated to their tactical nuclear weapons, which was an interesting thing to see, but there was no sort of wider statement around it. So it's one to watch, but I don't think, given France's strategic culture, that it's something that would be likely to happen.
I would completely agree with that, although obviously there is massive overlap in terms of France's vital national interests and NATO's sort of core interests in terms of defending the alliance. Beyond that, though, I think it needs to be kept in mind that French nuclear weapons would probably only be deployed in response to probably Russian, in the European context, Russian use of nuclear weapons. We aren't looking at sort of a first strike situation as we might have done during the Cold War. The conventional balance is not as lopsided as it was during the Cold War, so we're not sort of looking at the prospect of European being overrun by Russian or Soviet, as then Soviet forces. So the dynamic is somewhat different.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My immense gratitude both to Dr. Rowan Allport and Mr. William Freer. Thank you for taking the time out to give evidence to our inquiry into the UK's contribution to European security. Before we move on to our second panel, I will be calling the meeting to order in order that we can make adjustments. Order, order. Order, orders. Now we will be proceeding with the second panel of the committee's inquiry into UK's contribution to European security, and I am very, very pleased to welcome Professor Peter Roberts, who is an Associate Fellow at the Centre for Public Understanding of Defence and Security at the University of Exeter. And as I was just mentioning, Professor Roberts, you have an illustrious career of 23 years with the Royal Navy before going on to RUSI as well. Thank you very much for giving evidence. And without further ado, I'll invite my colleague, Alex Baker, to begin the questions.
Thank you, Chair. So we're going to start by focusing on the integrated air and missile defence piece. And I've got a starter for 10 to kick us off. So what exactly is the integrated air, what is integrated air and missile defence?
Right, it's a great question because it's all things to all men. There's a theory that says this is a sort of bubble that wraps over an area that provides it with the ability to deter, to defeat, to mitigate, to attrit any threats coming from air and space towards it. It's a great theory, and we've seen recent examples of this, particularly in Israel, Iron Dome, David Sling. You've heard President Trump talk about an American sort of golden dome over them. But in each of these circumstances, there's a historical feeling to some of these things, the dome, the shield, which does go back to a long history we have with this. It goes back to archers and slingers and this ability to provide some kind of protection. The UK also has a great history of this. I mean, during the Battle of Britain, the UK was attacked by drones, cruise missiles, fixed-wing aircraft at a huge rate a day. But in all those examples, including what we've seen in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Ukraine, in Syria, they're not foolproof. They don't provide this perfect solution that some people think they do. The integrated air and missile defence system aims to attrit, to mitigate the loss, but you are still going to take incoming hits, you are still going to have debris, you're still going to have death and destruction at the end of this. But there's no doubt it has become certainly more important. As a theory, it knits together international collaboration and diplomacy and the critical parts, which are the sensing of the threat, the detecting and tracking of the threat, the command and control about shooting it down or getting rid of it, attriting it, and then the effector, the missile, the direct energy weapon, whatever it is that then takes out the missile at the end, or the whatever it is that's coming towards you. And those are all critical elements and parts of it. I would say that there's a final point here that's worth noting, is that within an integrated air and missile defence system, this idea of a sort of ecosystem, a sort of biology of capabilities to negate these threats, offence and deterrence play a really important part. They are a third of what you need, that investment in the credibility of your deterrence and the ability to strike out. So if you're being hit from something from a Soviet enclave somewhere, do you have the will and the capability to go back and hit it? And those are big questions because they play a huge part in how the UK thinks that it currently addresses the threat coming towards it. But it is a sort of, it's a catch-all term, but it can get very technical very quickly about which sensors you want, who's going to make the command and control decisions, and how you're going to shoot down whatever it is that's coming towards you.
Thank you. So to follow on from that, I want to be really clear. What is the scope of the current threat which these sorts of systems address, and how has that threat changed in recent years?
So the threat is huge. It's proliferated enormously, and it ranges in everything from small drones with sort of real-time video targeting, all the way through cruise missiles, hyperballistic missiles, fighter aircraft, bomber aircraft, long-range hypersonic missiles, ballistic missiles, exo-atmospheric targeting, skipping missiles that skip on the edge of the atmosphere. But these are all things that have existed for a long time, right? When we go back to the Battle of Britain, 1940s, we've seen this over a long period of time. We know what it's done. There are a lot more continuities to the threat than there is some of the rhetoric and hyperbole about what's new. I guess the new stuff is really about speed, about scale, about mass, and about how we're being targeted and who's using it. So speed is sort of slightly deceptive. I mean, you think that the missiles that we had during the Cold War were capable of, over Mach 5, Mach 12, Mach 15. So we're talking about things that travel, 3, 4, 5 miles a second. Could make it here from Portsmouth. I got on the train this morning, took me, best part of 2 hours, 12 seconds for a missile flying and coming towards us. So the speed with which we're dealing with in this is really significant. The scale we're dealing with this is phenomenal. Nagorno-Karabakh 2020, we're seeing the occasional ballistic missile being fired. We have seen against Ukraine, Russia using the highest number of air and missile attacks in any one day that we've ever seen. It is enormous. The other things that we're seeing about who's using them is about the proliferation of the threat. So 5 years ago, we didn't think that, we Western military analysts thought that sophisticated missiles and drones were the capabilities of first world states only, certainly state actors. We might have seen Iran, North Korea, the Hermit Kingdom develop the kind of ballistic missiles that were scary, right? That should scare us. But these things are now being proliferated to insurgent groups, to proxies. It isn't just Hamas and Hezbollah. The Houthis have been executing for about 6 years something that the UK would be hard pushed to do as a military, a sophisticated time on target through a dense air defence environment to hit critical national infrastructure in Saudi Arabia using 6 different capabilities to hit it with a relatively short and accurate time on target. There aren't many militaries in the world that could achieve that, but this was something done by the Houthis 6 years ago. So, we've seen a difference in how they use it. I think one of the continuities that we seem to forget and perhaps should try and re-remember is the fact that we often have expected in our Western doctrine, how we think about air and missile defence, militaries like to think about it as how they're going to be attacked as a military. That's not how adversaries are attacking us. In nuclear theory, there's something called counter-force, which is how you attack the force that's attacking you to destroy their capability to attack you, and counter-value, which is attacking things that you value as a society. The ability for society to think, act as they wish. Those things that distract politicians, that distract leadership, that distract national security, are things that enable society to continue to survive. We saw that yesterday in Spain, where electricity grids were hit. We've seen it in Ukraine, where water infrastructure has been targeted. You could equally go after sewage systems. You could go after logistics resupply. You could go after major ports, power plants, whatever it is. The ability to undermine the will to fight, the core thing that enables you to deliver, is something that missiles and air platforms are now being targeted against. They're not being targeted to hit Portsmouth Dockyard. They're being targeted to hit the electricity that supplies London, the power plants that would go after us or supply us, the banking sector, the natural gas port through which all our 7-day supply of gas comes. All these things are the targets. These counter-value targets are what our adversaries are after. And this is what the military has never been tasked to look at since 1940. Protecting critical national infrastructure or the population, the military doesn't feel it's its role. And this is where the threat really exists and is proliferating. This is what it's going after. The political will and freedom to act, society's demands on politicians, that's what air and missile defence is being designed to do in smart countries, is to protect more of that.
So Lockheed Martin, in their written evidence to this committee, wrote, European and NATO allies currently lack the capability and mass for ground-based air defence, these effectors, particularly ballistic missiles and counter-hypersonics, while some Eastern European countries are making substantial effort to enhance these capabilities with the assistance of the US. The UK and other allies have not been able to rapidly pull together capability to address these capability gaps. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's largely true, right? I mean, there was a great belief in this idea of air superiority, that for Russia to launch an attack on the UK, you'd have to get through 600 F-35 platforms, to put it here. It's a sort of ridiculous feature of our history that we've believed in this safety of geography. The UK occupies this wonderful position. We're a long way from Russia. We have some water separating us. We have several sovereign states. There's lots of air defence out there. And actually, it's a myth. If Australia, a couple of years ago, the National Security Review, they recognised that the stopping power of water, that geography of isolation no longer protected them. We're a lot closer than they are to the threat. It bears a significant re-examination. Romania and Poland have made huge leaps in protecting the rest of Europe, frankly, by having the Aegis Ashore systems that they have, investing in Patriots, both manufacturing, fielding and weapon stocks that will do much will give them a hugely credible IAMD capability against the Russians. The UK, by comparison, has next to nothing. There are elements of investment that are happening in Germany and Norway and Sweden, Spain, Italy, amongst others, who are growing their capabilities in recognising the threat, which they did. 2014 was the start of it. 2022, obviously a massive recognition they needed to get into this space, and they've been building infrastructure capability and forward purchasing limited numbers of effectors to grow their own protection bubbles around critical national infrastructure. There is nothing that's going to provide a shield for Europe, but I think the Lockheed Martin evidence is pretty spot on. If it wasn't for the forward investment and forward thinking of former Eastern Bloc states, Poland, Romania in particular, then I think we'd be a lot worse off as a continent than we are right now.
We're going to go on and talk about how we sort this out, but I'd just like to sort of finish to ask you why do you think we haven't managed to get our act together on this? There has been a recognition over the past decade about these sorts of more of a recognition of those sorts of threats, but what has stopped us actually getting ourselves in a better place on this stuff?
I think we've been dishonest with the public, we've been dishonest with politicians like yourselves, and there's been no political will to make the difficult decisions and be honest with the public and say, we're not going to stop missiles coming and hitting you. There are a set of you that are going to die, that hospitals are going to go under, that you're going to be without food and water and sewers and electricity. And we've not been brave enough to tell the public that what happens in Israel every day is a realistic scenario for London or Manchester or Edinburgh or Inverness tomorrow. That the enemy has the capability and the intent to do this and is actively considering it. And yet we somehow have felt and deceived ourselves, but more importantly the public, in the fact that, don't worry about it, everything will be fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Derek, quick, please.
Yeah, just following on from that, I've been raising this issue for a couple of years now. I previously questioned the two previous Defence Secretaries, Ben Wallace and Grant Shapps. And my last question back in May 24 to Grant Shapps, part of his reply, so I'm paraphrasing, he said, we're working with our European friends and allies on a European Sky Shield to do something along the lines of what's been described. Now this referred to the command paper refresh, if you recall that, page 89 for reference. It should be understood, however, there are considerations regardless of which direction we take, because again, money can be spent once. Now, I thought to draw you to the issue of, have the government been serious about developing integrated air missile defence? And if it's not given priority within the SDR, does that suggest that it hasn't been given priority?
I don't know whether it's been given priority in the current SDR or not.
No, I'm saying the new one, if it's not in the new SDR as a priority, would that suggest it's not a real commitment to deliver that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you think it has to be as part of that?
It has to be. It was one of those specified tasks that the SDR was supposed to look at. Yeah. Of course, the SDR is this sort of independent paper, so whether the government response to the SDR is almost what's important, is how it will do. There's obviously been some collaboration and rewrites of the SDR itself. The problem is that most of the conversation around some kind of missile defence shield, an IAM DS, is based around the effectors, the missiles or the direct energy weapons that will shoot down whatever's coming towards you. Actually, a critical part of this are the sensors that you're going to use to detect it, because otherwise you can have all the missiles that you want in the world, but nothing's going to help. So the systems that will detect it, the command and control systems are going to put it together. So on all that infrastructure will take as long as it will be if you order missiles tomorrow for them to arrive. It's going to take just as long to put that infrastructure together.
Do you have a sort of reasonable idea of a timescale that would take, just a sort of ballpark?
Well, I think that there are apocryphal figures, so they're probably not quite right. But if you wanted to order an Aster missile now, you'd probably, and you put money down today, you'd get it from MBDA in 2 years' time. And I think that's really fortunate, because if you're trying to get a Patriot or a THAAD capability, then you're talking late 2020s, early 2030s. It's going to take you that long to buy, build, put in your sensors, develop the infrastructure that gives you the links to the command and control networks, to network in those systems with the European wide area picture and with some of the capabilities the US might offer, and deliver that. So you do get a system. So, realistically, you announce it tomorrow. You're not going to have, depending on what capability you want, you're not going to have anything basic within 2 years. More likely, you're looking possibly 10 years before you have a mature system. And the more you delay things like Project Lewis, which was the ballistic missile radar, it was announced, I can't remember when it was, 2019 I think was the last review. It's not going to start building until 2029. Start building. Realistically, this has not been a priority. And because the government has been able to, successive governments have been able to defer decisions, do we hope this will be different in the SDR?
But just to pursue it in terms of integrated view, would it have to be a European-wide system, not just a UK system? Because otherwise, because you are talking about a layered system as well, because it's not just obviously missiles fired from the ground, but obviously aircraft and everything else. I mean, we've seen that what happened in Israel in one instance. So it's really integrating it in the European context, is it not?
Yeah, exactly. As I talked about, that part of that infrastructure is the multinational connectivity. So the feeds that you would get from whether it's Norway or Sweden or Poland in particular, Romania, maybe Germany, but, so you would federate all of those feeds and take a feed of them into your own system. In the same way, the UK would be required to contribute its wide area picture back in, because it will give it some.
Would it be a case of us actually transferring, I'm being simplistic here, of placing our system, or some of our system, in other European countries, not all based in the UK?
It could be. Yeah. It depends how you share it and what the sort of legal arrangements are, and what you're happy with the risk. Are you happy that Poland's Aegis Ashore system defends part of the UK from that vector that they're facing? Are you content that Kongsberg Marine in Norway, that they're able to provide you with some of the protection to the north and mitigate or attrit some of that threat coming to you? Does it have to be British up there? Can it be an agreement, a mutually beneficial agreement between the two? What part does the UK play in that? How does it look north or to the threat axis before you're finally attriting attacks that would come in, or shorter range attacks that would come in from perhaps the west, for example?
So basically, what you're explaining is the complications. It's not just saying let's have a missile defence system. Actually, what will that be? Where will it be placed? Because there's probably little likelihood you can have an umbrella, even Israel can't guarantee, across the whole of the UK. And is it one about preventing, moving things closer to where possibly missiles might be fired from? So that's what I think you're saying. It needs. We actually don't actually have a picture yet of what we mean by this.
I think that's half the problem is that it doesn't take long to articulate what you actually need, yeah, and what you're prepared to pay for, yeah, and how that would work. That's not difficult. I mean, we've done the physics for a long time. We have the ability to shoot down, yeah, a hypersonic missile in space, and we've been able to do that since the 1980s. This is something that's flying at Mach 2, hundreds of miles from the Earth, and we can shoot it down with another missile fired from Earth. I mean, the physics problem of that is phenomenal. The problems we're facing now are relatively simple. This is not really a physics problem. It's about cooperation, it's about political agreement, it's about alignment, and it's about weapon stocks and all that other stuff that comes with it. So those parts are the really important parts to get done. It's not a difficult problem. It's just no one has felt the need to do it or placed it as a priority thus far.
And specify what exactly it wants.
Exactly.
And just finally, I'm probably putting you in an impossible position here, but in terms of cost terms, what are we talking in? In the billions, in hundreds of millions?
It's a really difficult thing. I posed this, so I think that the greatest mind in IAMD systems is a guy called Tom Caracal, PhD, who works at CSIS in Washington. And I asked him this very question: if you were starting
from scratch, you're facing the Russian threat, pretty much in the UK's position, what would we be expecting this to cost? And he wouldn't give me an answer. It's certainly in the billions. I think we're in the realm of 20 billion, but it's not a one-off cost. It's a recurring cost, and it's an evolving cost. So you can't just simply ignore it and hope it goes away. You can't just field your systems for now, because it's a dynamic. The adversary develops new systems, increases the stealth capability of some of the missiles, uses some manoeuvring that might defeat your current system. So it's a constant evolution. And then, you're hoping that, in 10, 15 years, direct energy and lasers will help to mitigate some of that threat and reduce the overall cost of it. But I think, if we're talking around 20 billion, probably over a 5 to 10 year period, we wouldn't be too far off, depending on what you want.
Okay, thank you.
You want Jeroen, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Roberts, for coming to the committee today. From the West Country, I'm the MP for North Devon, so I'm in Exeter quite a lot. So the committee visited Finland and Estonia, and we were really, really impressed with the societal resistance from the communities, the plans in place, if they were under attack, in this case from Russia. And that all movement within the communities, it's like everybody had a role across all age spectrums, and they were really, really in that domain of really prepared for conflict. So in your view, does societal resistance play a role in the integrated air and missile defence arena?
Yes, I think I said earlier that we've been dishonest with the public, such that at the moment they seem to believe that there's no threat to them from an air or missile attack. And I think that's dishonest. I think there is more honesty if you talk in the Baltics, Central Europe, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, the Balts, Scandinavian countries you visited. I mean, there's more honesty with the population and more honesty from the government, which says we can't protect you entirely. We're not wrapping you in bubble wrap. We're going to attrit the figures, but there's going to be some real difficulty coming up, and therefore your resilience to these attacks and strikes is really important. They have a different societal culture, a different makeup than we do. I'm not going to call it a nanny state here, but there is a requirement for them to, as members of the public, to be able to respond and react to things that happen. They've been given instructions for years and have grown up with instructions about ready bags for themselves and their pets, about keeping medication, 7-day supply of wood, the ability to have your own generator, all these things that give you the resilience, which then give politicians the freedom to continue to act and react in strategic ways rather than reacting to individual domestic pressures. And that's what these systems are really designed to do, is to provide us with the continuing freedom to act. The UK maintains, it's a thorn in Russia's side because it has this almost unique political voice within Europe that gives Europe backbone in many ways. If you remove that, both that voice and that political freedom to operate, because you're focused on domestic pressures, because there is no civil resilience, then President Putin gets a much freer hand in Europe and with the UK. So civil resilience provides an absolutely fundamental part of not just an integrated air and missile defence system, but the whole of defence and the political will of the country. It's our will to fight more than anything else, and it really needs to be developed somewhat more than it has.
So what is your current assessment of the UK societal resilience at the moment?
Pretty negligible. I think, everything that we've built in infrastructure terms is not based around resilience. So, for example, and it came out in the pandemic, we build our NHS hospitals to 100% efficiency capacity, right? So when they run during the day, every week, normal month, normal year, at 100% capacity. The French, for example, build their hospitals at 125 to 150% capacity. So they automatically have an additional capacity. It's inefficient, but it's resilient. So you look anywhere where you've got efficiencies, one of those things that you're desperate for, and you find that you lack resilience. Efficiency and resilience are often mutually exclusive, particularly in infrastructure terms. So, the idea, therefore, that we are working on a just enough, just in time supply chain, minimal strategic reserves, just enough banking to get us through the day. These are the things that will unpick our strategic resilience. And it's in our national culture. Unpicking that is not an easy task for you as leaders of the country, right?
So where would you start now if we were to increase that societal resilience here in the UK? Where would we start to improve that resilience?
So I think there's two things. One is a conversation with the public, which has to be honest. I mean, less of this strong at home, strong abroad stuff, and more being honest with people is, there are significant threats to the UK. We needn't get overexcited about them because, frankly, we've been dealing with terrorism for years and we're pretty good at it. But we need you to start being prepared, and this is what the threat looks like, and this is what the implications are. This isn't something that the British public are going to get incredibly excited over. But if it's explained to them, I think that you'll find that they will acknowledge the problem and take their own small measures that would do it. I think that would go a long way. The other side of it is looking at the drive for efficiencies. The more you drive efficiencies in critical national infrastructure, the less resilience you have. And so, governments and the committees that advise them have really got to take a role and start saying, efficiencies are all very well, but we're not running a business. We're maintaining, looking after, and growing a prosperous society. And to do that, you need to build in resilience to national infrastructure, build to 125% capacity, build to 105% capacity, and it would help, such that when you cancel a train, something doesn't happen, or when part of the national grid gets knocked out, you don't lose everything that society relies on, including hospital supplies for periods of days. Those are the key things that I think would really help and start to build it up.
Thank you.
Thank you much. Just to delve further into societal resilience, Calvin Bailey, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm very grateful that you brought up some of those issues, because these are things that we struggle to land, to be able to communicate the need to have excess capacity, which is fundamentally a military thing, right? That's what the military does. It is your reserve. So that capacity that you're talking about in terms of hospitals in particular could be something that you harbour in military hospitals in the way that we used to, because that removes the tendency to use all the capacity that is available were you to attribute that to the NHS. It would be very difficult to be able to withhold 25% of your requirement when you need to surge. So could I have your view on harbouring that capacity in dedicated military hospitals that could maybe be offered to NATO as well as a tier 4 or tier 3 type capability?
I think military hospitals are one of those things that every military commander loves and wants whenever they go on a mission. Whether it's a UN mission, a peacekeeping mission, a large-scale military deployment, an exercise, whatever. Everyone loves a military hospital. It's something like the Romanian bath and shower unit that is, one of the most demanded military capabilities anywhere in NATO, all around the world, because no one else has one. So military hospitals are great. The problem is when you draw military hospitals from NHS staff, you're at 100% capacity. So additional doctors, additional nurses, additional, yes.
The point I'm making is the 1990s, pre-1990s, we need not deployable, fixed infrastructure that acts as national resilience, to which we can surge into either through national resilience or military use. So if we have an attack within society, that we can surge into it. So COVID would have surged into the military hospitals, or you can also offer it as a NATO capability, which NATO can then surge into should there be a war on continental Europe. Not a deployable capability, not overlapping the NHS, an entirely separate offering.
I think that would be a very prudent use of money and assets. The problem is attracting the additional numbers of doctors and nurses and support staff that go with it. But certainly, you follow that down a sort of US model where US military medical capability services the veterans, communities and their families. When I was deployed to America with my family, we were looked after by the American military medical facility that was there. I mean, it was amazing, and it's a huge part of the offer that the American government can make to their people. That you come and work for us in the military, you get medical treatment that is second to none. But it also provides that additional capability from whether it's veterans who suffer specific issues with PTSD or physical welfare or whatever it may be, to providing that additional bumper capacity that you need in things like global pandemics. So yes, I think it's a win-win.
Thank you. And just before we leave this line of questioning, you spoke just the understanding of what the threat we're actually facing, and I point back to your remarks about we haven't been honest enough with society, particularly like your stuff about resilience. But the lessons from V2, Houthis versus Saudi Arabia and Ukraine show us that most of these systems reach over Warden's first ring, which is fielded military forces. And in that discussion, we have to say the way that warfare will manifest itself will be reaching over that ring straight to population, infrastructure, key production, system essentials. So if we're going to defend against that, pan-Europe, what should our fielded forces actually look like? And do you think there is an adequate understanding of the lessons, all the way back to V2, that show us really what our integrated defence system should look like?
Yeah, so there's three parts to that. It's a really great question, right? So the first part, will it reach over? Yes. The second part, what should our military forces look like? So whilst the counter value proposition that the enemy is attacking us and the things we care about, our vital interests, our will to fight, our ability for society to function, what they care about is not the same thing. They don't value their population. We could, the ability to go and knock tower blocks down in Moscow just hasn't worked for Ukraine because the leadership don't care about it. That's not a counter-value proposition. What they care about are their forces. And so our forces need to be designed to attack their forces exactly as they have been doing, but in a way that meets a modern style of warfare. But at the same time, we've got to build this ability to defend ourselves, to be resilient, to withstand their attacks on us. Them and us were fighting in very different ways, and it doesn't allow us to surge one to do the other in many ways. They're mutually exclusive capabilities and forces. That's the difficulty that we've got in dealing with this stuff. What we've underfunded since the 1990s has been a small professional deployable force that can go and fight other militaries around the world. That's absolutely fine because that's mostly what our adversaries value. What we haven't done is defend ourselves against how adversaries are fighting us. And I think that's where we mismatch the arguments and the Ministry of Defence in particular, I think right across the national security community, has had real problems with weighing these things together, which is why you see Keir Giles and Mark Galley after making waves with this stuff. It's not new. We've understood it for years, but finally I think we're getting to understand that actually the military don't do a lot of this defence of the homeland stuff. That's up to something else.
Thank you very much. Jesse Norman, please.
Thank you very much indeed. Greatly enjoying your testimony. Thank you so much. Can I just go to, on the question of integrated air and missile defence, give you what I think is a summary of what you're saying to me, just so I understand it. What you're saying is we're expecting this to be a defensive activity which is simultaneously defensive in the pure sense but also offensive in the sense of having a deterrent capability. So it's quite an ambitious scope of thing that we're contemplating. there's enormous ambiguity as to whether it would be based in any particular place and what its scope of coverage would be. Is it a periphery-only defence system, or is it, as it were, based throughout Europe in order to cover all eventualities? The area obviously potentially being enormous, from Norway down to Turkey. You're saying that there's nothing that really could fill any gaps that we might determine in scale for 5 to 10 years. And you're saying that technologies that might be enormously valuable may render some of these capabilities irrelevant or supplement them. It seems to me that what you're really saying, therefore, is that we don't have any kind of strategy, we don't have the beginnings of an understanding of what we're trying to do at the moment in this. Is that a fair description?
No, I think that's if I've presented that, I'm really sorry, because I think there are.
Oh, I'm just being a little bit provocative just to get a sense of exactly where we are going.
So I think you paint a very accurate picture. Deterrence, defence. The offence part is really important there. The ability to go out and strike the archer, take his fingers. This sort of stuff is really important. Societal resilience, yes. Yes, there's the ambiguity is about what we want to protect, and I think those are political discussions, right? That's a set of political priorities. The military, if you go to them and say, well, protect my dockyard, protect my bases. If you give me a third thing to protect, protect my family patch. Quite rightly, because that's in their interest. They won't say protect London. They won't say, they might say protect Faslane, very important. They won't say protect Edinburgh or the Houses of Parliament, or, they won't say, individual...
We're hoping Hereford will be included.
Right, maybe, but, would they talk about, the national infrastructure for gas that should be... So, a mature understanding of what you actually want to protect is really important. Then there's the how. I think if you go to the NATO BMD Centre, they have a really accurate way of putting it on the map, and there are individuals almost within the Ministry of Defence that could draw you a plan very quickly about how you would put this online and bring it to maturity. The idea that I'm not saying that technology makes conventional systems will make conventional systems obsolete at all. I have zero hope that technology and direct energy weapons will provide a solution to this in 30 years. They'll provide one element to one small part of the problem in the threat matrix. They won't provide anything like the full spectrum capability. But yes, what we need is policy, and then we need a plan, and then we need some contracts.
Okay, great. Where does the UK have specific capabilities, experience, expertise that would fit into a sensible plan of that kind?
So the interesting thing is that the UK, like most countries, is not starting from a baseline of zero. So you have RF filing veils, the joint US UK radar capability. You have another set of small elements of ground-based air defence that provides you with some skill and understanding of what it takes to defend an area against a modern set of threats. You have a very vibrant R&D base that is developing things like dragonfire, lasers, direct energy. You have a very good understanding of the electromagnetic spectrum and the area, the geography of the country, where radars are and the ability to defend it. You have a systems integrator set of companies who could pull together all the raw radar from around the country and provide you with a really good composite picture of composite air. And you have the skills in some of our companies that provide to overseas clients in air and missile defence, so those that deal with Poland, Sweden, France, and sell back to the US. You have some expertise in this that is great. Do we have anything that is unique to us? Probably not. Do we start from a good place? Yes, we do. Do we have a huge number of partners who would be more than willing to help us out? In fact, delighted to help us out? Absolutely. And more importantly, we're not going to be fast failures at this. We're not going to be throwing money down into some experimental hole that might deliver us with nothing. We know what works. We've got so many countries around the world, Australia, Japan, South Korea, who are vibrant in these areas that will provide us with a huge amount of expertise and an opportunity to be fast adopters and to be clever adopters. We don't need to go through their experimentation, their failures. We know what works, we know what doesn't work, and the ability for us to get value for money based on their experience is huge.
Okay, so within the context of Europe and NATO, as the plan develops in some proposed way, we would be focusing in certain areas of strength and we'd be offering those areas of strength to other allies, and we would not be delivering or developing certain areas in reliance of what they would be doing, right, for fear of duplication and all the regular stuff. First of all, are there risks associated with not developing certain areas that others might be? And the second is, where are the principal areas of weakness where we might be reliant on other partners across NATO and Europe?
I just don't want to forget that second part. In fact, let's do that first. What are we reliant on others in NATO for? Well, right now we're very much reliant on NATO to do almost everything with regards to our protection, which includes fielding a credible military force.
But on air and particularly on air
and this is where I think the interesting part comes in, because whilst we gain huge benefits from the layered protection we get from Polish Aegis Ashore, from German Patriots, from Italian SAMP-T, all the myriad of systems that mean something fired from Russia to us has to get through the 600 F-35 sort of argument. That's great. But what if a civilian freighter off the southwest approaches in a container fires a bunch of cruise missiles, which are containerized and available pretty much off the shelf, fires those at the West Country and our strategically important gas offloading port from there, which just bypasses all of that lovely sort of western. So the risks.
Maginot Line scenario, right? We're pointing the wrong
completely.
direction. Yeah.
So the risks are that if you just rely on the European physical capability, then you ignore the fact that what we're responsible for, the sort of guardians of the Western Atlantic, the West and the North, for all of NATO, for all of Europe, we have a responsibility that we've neglected because we didn't think it was possible to put a missile on a ship and fire it at the homeland. You know, these are key capabilities that we need to be investing in and be able to do. Yes, we can rely on them to do so much, but we have a duty and a responsibility to do the rest of it. The other responsibility we have, and I'm just putting this in because I think it's really important, is we talk about an integrated air and missile defence for the UK, but what about our overseas territories? Right, they're a huge soft underbelly to UK interests.
To which we have a defence commitment.
To which we have an obligation, and legal commitments. And yet, have we thought about how we defend server farms and hospitals in Gibraltar, or critical national infrastructure in Cyprus, or the Falkland Islanders and their vitally important port? Has this even featured in any discussions? I mean, quite frankly, it hasn't. We're just sort of relying on hope and optimism bias that nothing will manifest itself this way. That's not the way that Moscow looks at it. For them, an attack on Cyprus or on Gibraltar or in the Falklands would undermine UK credibility. And as such, a couple of missiles or drones that fly into power plants in Stanley work equally well as an attack on Edinburgh. So, this idea that we can think about it in geographic terms, I think is slightly problematic when we think about the threat actors and what they're playing against us.
So our soft targets are essentially everywhere that the British history extends in terms of its current obligations because of its feedback effect on sentiment, public opinion, and, as it were, democratic values.
If you're doing your threat mapping, it's how you define, your vital interests.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I believe Calvin Bailey wanted to come in on this point.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Just before we leave this point, Jesse was highlighting our unique capabilities and the idea that we could amplify these to meet our greatest challenges. Well, the greatest challenge is funding, and one of our unique capabilities is our banking sector. Some of the work that Alex Baker and Luke Chalmers have been doing to highlight the importance of a defence security resilience bank is critical, I think, to addressing that greatest challenge. Is this something that you have a view on?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely echo that. The Defence and Security Bank for Europe is an absolutely fundamental part of putting us in a position that allows us to react to the threat as it exists. It's slightly disappointing that the government took so long to get on board with the initiative. It was talked about, more than a year ago, and we could have been further down this line now. But the fact that it has broad-based support now is really important, and is a huge opportunity that we should be grasping with both hands. Whether we're directing that towards Joint Expeditionary Force, sort of mini-alliance in the north, or NATO-wide, or the important thing about this is the one thing the bank gives us more than anything else is the ability to do larger cooperative buys, to signal industry with contracts, not words, that here is a multi-year buy for whatever missile, whatever sensors we want, and we want you to sustain it for us and maintain it and deliver it. This is a contract that you can bank and you can now build additional capacity on. Without that, industry has been sat there, and they play a huge part in this. Industry is sat there hearing promises from government since the 1990s about we will buy, we will invest. None of it has delivered to the extent that industry has been prepared to invest. Why should it be different now? Why should industry believe what is being said? The bank gives us that ability to suddenly say, it's not just additional little bits of money from the UK, but it's little bits of money from the UK, from Norway, from Sweden, from Canada, and put that together in an amalgamated buy, and that looks like suddenly second, third, fourth production line for effectors, growing 100 new sensor operators, the ability for us to free ourselves up, additional money up, gain the efficiencies to, say, a new military field hospital, in Birmingham or Bradford or wherever it is. These are really important things that they can give us, and I think the bank is a really important stepping stone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Roberts, obviously since the Cold War, actually within the Cold War, there was actually a surface-to-air missile barrier which was extended from Norway to Turkey, and I believe that was then decommissioned post the Second World War, and since then there's been a lot of talk about an integrated air and missile defence system for Europe. But despite there being a NATO IAMD, and despite all of that talk, there still has not been enough collaboration to deliver a comprehensive solution. Now, in your opinion, what's been the greatest challenge to an effective European integrated air and missile defence system?
National political will in each country. Yeah, and it's something you're familiar with, right? Is you have your demands, Poland has their demands, Finland has their demands, and they slightly differ. And then there's the sovereignty problem. You want to invest, £3 billion over 3 years in missile defence, but you'd like some jobs out of that and some tax revenue. You're not entirely happy to pass it over to, a builder in Italy or in France and see nothing for it. So each, quite rightly, has a demand from the taxpayer to see some return rather than just protection. And each government nationally has those demands. No one has said, we're just doing this for the good of humanity and for the good of Europeans. There is a trade-off, and there's something you want from it. So that's one of the problems. Has there been cooperation? Is it possible to cooperate and collaborate and put this together? Absolutely. Is it difficult? Not particularly. Are there legal things that stand in the way? There are a few, but they're not insurmountable if the political will is put behind it. And there has been a certain amount of political will commensurate with the threat.
So, for example, the NATO BMD initiative, which is a brilliant capability developed really since the 1980s, networks together a huge amount of data and capabilities and some effectors. I go back to Poland's Aegis Ashore, Romania, and then the US Navy ships in Rota. These give you a capability. Is it wide enough for Europe? No. You look at the European Sky Shield initiative, again, a select number of countries have gone through this because perceptions of the threat are very different.
Yeah. But you mentioned about national interests. Now, if we look at the European Air Defence Shield, it was assumed that the EU was going to take the lead. In fact, they'd stated that they wanted to take the lead on that initiative. However, within the EU's white paper on defence, that was not acknowledged about the integrated air and missile defence, and it has actually been acknowledged that there are huge capability gaps in air and missile defence. So do you think that the EU or somebody within Europe, do you think that they can finally coalesce and agree on this, or do you think that it will not see the light of day?
If we wait for the EU and for everyone to get on board, we will be operating at the pace of the slowest member who is most resistant to this. And in some cases, you might think, for example, Portugal has no real interest in air and missile defence, and therefore why would it get involved? And it has a veto over this. So how do you develop it? Which is why initiatives like Sky Shield and NATO BMD and national programmes really take priority. And your ability to network those together is the most effective way of delivering short-term defence capability. This is not dissimilar to what Ukraine found, right? They had to put together modern military systems that were given to them by Norway and Kongsberg. They had to put through modern air traffic radars that were gifted to them by Slovenia and Slovakia. They had to pull together Russian equipment that they had in storage and that was gifted to them by Poland that was capable of air defence. And they had to plug all this stuff together in a sort of ad hoc sort of capability, integrate all the data, put out the firing solutions, set the command and control network together and operate it in a way that was, pretty complex. And they managed it really, really fast because they had to. So I think, this is not impossible, it's plugging it together. If we wait for sort of institutional, multinational programme, there'll be significant inertia behind it. What that doesn't mean is that EU money cannot be put into stovepipes that deliver some of this for some clients. But waiting for a EU or an EC or a NATO dedicated capability, I think will involve delays that the threat doesn't give us time for.
Okay, and in your opinion, the UK should be very much involved and at the heart of any European air defence system or the European Sky Shield system?
I think the UK would be foolish not to be deeply involved. I think for us to be at the heart of it would, if I was a partner looking in at the UK and the UK said we'd like to be at the heart of it, I wonder why you deserve that. You've done very little to enable these initiatives. You haven't bought into the programs. You don't own any of your stuff. You're learning from scratch on the systems that we're buying. Come and be a member. Put this at the heart of your defence capability if you wish to, but don't think you're taking a leading role in this because, frankly, you haven't stumped up thus far.
And what about the US then? Should they be playing a leading role or some role in a European integrated air and missile defence? And if so, what?
I think the US have bigger problems to deal with right now than European integrated air and missile defence capability. Your previous panel talked about China. I mean, the ground-based interceptors of the US, which they've spent hundreds of billions of pounds putting together, is in a threat from the Hermit Kingdom, North Korea, firing a potential missile at some stage in the future against the US homeland. Their investment was against a threat which didn't exist at the time, but they thought could develop. So their patience with Europe to develop something against a known threat a known intent from an adversary right on their doorstep, I think they find hard to believe. They have bigger problems. Now, the US, I think, would be only too happy to help and to facilitate some of this capability. The support that Europeans have received in terms of from the United States, both in foreign military sales, but also from industry, whether it's about Patriot, THAAD, spy radars, Aegis Ashore, SM3, SM6, I mean, you name it, the capabilities the US provide are second to none, but they're also unique. Some things that Europe cannot build by themselves at the moment. The US would be only too happy for Europe to be able to continue to operate those, and would, I think, be happy to continue to sell them. Just don't expect to be at the top of the priority list on the production line when they've got China, North Korea, Iran, and a variety of problems around the world, which they are trying to build the capacity to be able to act and defend themselves against. And they will look at America first.
Well, I think given the current geopolitical shifts, you may well be right there, Professor Roberts. Well, look, but it was my job to ask the question just to make sure that we had things on record for our inquiry. Professor Roberts, thank you very much for appearing to give evidence to our inquiry. And I am sure that this will be featuring within our inquiry report. Thank you very much. Order